I was a city kid growing up. I grew up in North Vancouver. After school, I went and worked in Toronto in the, kind of corporate world. I'd studied business and finance at school. So, coming from that, it's a very, it's very far away from where I am today now in a town of, 300 to 500 people in a very remote setting. And actually, Robin and I met while I was living in Toronto and working that job. And it was meeting him and hearing a little bit about his parents who had actually moved from Toronto themselves to the north and been back to the Landers in the 70s and 80s. So they actually, not far from here, built a little cabin in the woods, lived out there off land with their, I think it was 8 or maybe a dozen sled dogs. And they did that for 2 years. And hearing that story, in the middle of a cafe in Toronto just really struck me that people could even live like that today. I didn't think that was a possibility. So I think that quite lit the spark or lit the fire. And after Robin and I got together, we had the opportunity to move onto a sailboat in Vancouver. There are these slips in a little cooperative marina called Spruce Harbor, and they don't come up very often. And so this was a kind of unique opportunity through my mom, where where we had an opportunity to live on a sailboat. So we thought, well, that sounds different. It really appealed to me. I was looking for a change in life. And so we started there in this little marina and met other people who had sailed around the world, gone on big cruising trips, across the ocean, across the Pacific. And after a couple of years, we thought, well, maybe we could do the same. And so we spent 3 years starting in 2015 sailing from Vancouver. We first of all went around Vancouver Island, which, I still feel is actually some of the most beautiful cruising we did. BC is such a stunning part of this world. And then we went down the coast to Mexico. All of this sort of learning really as we went. I mean, I had grown up sailing dinghies. Robin, I think the nearest thing he'd been to as a sailboat was an ice boat on this lake, which is a very different kind of boating. And we continued down to Mexico, stayed there, and ultimately crossed the Pacific and sold our boat in Australia. But while we were in Mexico, Robin's dad passed away. And so we came up here to spend time with his mom, and it was really just a wonderful experience for me to spend 6 months in a small town, something I'd never done before, and really, get to know what life would be like up here. And by the end of that 6 months, I was just completely sold on living in a small place, living in Atlin, and so we started looking for a property here. My first published article was for a magazine called Good Old Boat, and we were living on our sailboat at the time without a fridge. And so I was always struggling to keep greens fresh. And Robin and I devised this little system where we would hold a bunch of sort of like little cups of water, and inside that we'd have all of our leafy greens and our kale and keep our vegetables from kind of turning horrible on us. And I just thought, well, I was so proud of this. And so I wrote into an editor and said, would you consider my piece about keeping your vegetables fresh on a boat? And she said, yeah, absolutely. And so that became my first piece. I think it was called How Green Is Your Galley. And from there, it was just every time we learned something on the boat, every time we had a mishap, whether it was the engine failing or our rudder breaking and having to drop it in sort of in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific, to experiences, helping other boats, towing other boats in from bad weather. All those things just turn into articles. It came very naturally. And it was also a nice way for us, because we weren't earning any income on our travels, to be able to support ourselves and put a little bit of money in the cruising kitty. Yeah, I think it was a very natural evolution because moving, to a small town, a small rural place is very much like moving onto a sailboat in that there's just so much to learn. I mean, I'd never used a chainsaw before. I'd never, split my own firewood before. And so it was just very natural to start pitching those articles to magazines like Cottage Life. Um, and writing about my experiences. For example, my first job here was as a bartender in a small northern community bar, and that turned into the piece for the Tyee. So yeah, it was like quite a natural progression. It's a small, quirky festival, and you'll commonly see them in northern towns. Whitehorse holds the biggest celebration, and it occurs in February. And this is a time of year where everyone's been cooped up in their cabins, everyone has cabin fever, and it's really an opportunity to get out and burn off some steam. And these festivals have been running for decades. I think it was the 60th anniversary for Yukon Rendezvous. This last year, and there's events like chainsaw chucking and flower packing and dog howling. So it's really just kind of a wild time to be here. And I thought this is a special time to feature the North, and I thought the Times might be interested in that. And it was quite lucky, actually. They just happened to have wanted to write a piece about winter tourism in the Yukon for a few years, and so they said, well, this sounds like a great entry point into all the great activities, whether it's Northern Lights viewing or dog sledding that you can do up here in the north. And yeah, so it was very much kind of a collaborative effort in terms of directing where that article ultimately landed. I think, and I can say this as a city person, I mean, I think there's a great romance about the north. It's a place where people come to get away from perhaps some of the confines of the 9 to 5 and just some of the routines of city life, uh, and so I think that was a big part of why people came up, and when they were presented with an opportunity to work remotely. There was one point, I think, in Atlin where you couldn't rent a place and you couldn't buy a piece of land. It was sort of that much of a draw. People wanting to take the opportunity of having this time off work to really try out a totally radical, different way of living. Waterborne is a site where I share stories that describe how to live on a boat, how to go traveling on a sailboat. And that came out of a conversation with the editors at Good Old Boat magazine, where I had started my kind of magazine writing career. And they said, we don't see any young people in boating. And we wonder if it's maybe got something to do with the media. Maybe we're not, young people are not as interested in magazines. Is there another way to reach them? And so Robin and I started documenting our experiences. And this was also at a time when, a lot of the sailing vlogs were taking off, like Sailing La Vagabond. And so we spent a bit of time building up the material, building up the content for folks to learn, how they could make that step from being a landlubber to off on their own sailing adventure. Oh gosh, there's so many things that I would love to write books about. One that I'm working on right now is a memoir about my time working in Toronto as a management consultant and being in business school, and really making that transition into a writing life and sailing, and yeah, a very, very different approach to life overall.